Science Setup lectures, myself and Chris, Jack, on Monday and Tuesday. Now we're getting a little bit more into the practice and policy space, and we're very lucky to have Helen Davies here, who's going to be talking to us about the City of Cape Town's sort of climate change response, I guess what they've done and what they're planning to do and what their policies are going to be like. So Helen is Head of Environmental Policy and Planning in the City of Cape Town. She's got specific responsibilities for the city's climate change policy, so kind of what are they going to do and strategy side of it. And then particularly for coordinating all the adaptation actions that are happening in the city. So both in terms of planning and also implementing adaptation actions. So that's sort of at the coalface type work. And then she's also responsible for coordinating and leading the work that the city does on green economy, which is a bigger sort of domain that encompasses essentially what an environmentally sustainable economy might look like. Helen is another of these people who never seem to have left UCT. She's got a BSc in Environmental Science and Oceanography, then did honours in Atmospheric Science, rather like Chris Jack, and then a Master's in Conservation Biology, also at UCT, and then finished off with an MBA at UCT. And then, so she's got more degrees than most of us put together, I think. She's been working for the last 20 odd years or so in both public and private practice, if you like. Initially in the City of Cape Town, it was a junior position. Then she went to the UK for a while and worked in the sustainability division of a county council there. Came back and did quite a bit of consulting work on sustainability issues. And then, I guess, about 5 years ago, so 6 years ago, moved to the provincial government to work in the climate change division there. And then a couple of years ago, moved back to the city into her current position. So she's got many years' experience in the public sector, and I'd like you to welcome her. And look forward to listening to her talk. I also have to do some advertising on behalf of the summer school team. So on Friday, this Friday at 9:30 in the morning in the new Economics building, which is just the next door building on the Cape Town side of this one, there's a film starting at 9:30 called Cool Earth. And it's one of a series of climate change related films. This one is particularly around understanding how we might actually work to get the Earth a bit cooler, I guess. Yeah. So 9:30 a.m. on Friday, if you're looking for something to do.
Great, thanks very much for the introduction, Mark. Thank you very much for your time today. What I'd like to run us through is just a sense of framing the policy. How do we see climate change in the city? How do we think we should be approaching climate change? And also looking at our context. What is our current context in terms of greenhouse gas emissions and in terms of climate change adaptation? What are the key risks that we face as a city? Then look importantly at what we've done to date. We certainly aren't starting from a clean slate. The city's been working on a lot of climate change related action for some time. So I'll run you through some of that work. And then look at really what keeps me awake at night. What's the gap between where we're trying to go and what we've implemented to date? And then just close off with how we close that gap. So in terms of framing the policy, very simply, you've had the scientific and technical discussions in the last 2 days in terms of climate change globally, locally, and some of the key changes we're expecting to see in Cape Town. But in a very brief nutshell, we're looking at potentially a decrease in average annual rainfall for Cape Town, but also a change in seasonality of that rainfall. When we do get our rainfall, we're looking at having that in increased storm events, so increased frequency and magnitude of storm events. We're looking at increased temperatures, so that's not just average temperatures, but also increased number of days with heat waves, extreme temperature days. If you thought Cape Town was windy enough, we're looking at increased average wind speeds, an increased number of days with extreme winds, and all of this on top of a mean sea level rise. So what does that mean for Cape Town? Just a few photographs to take you through some of the key impacts we're likely to see from climate change and that we are partly already experiencing at the moment. Potentially flooding and damage of infrastructure from increased rainfall, but on the other side, potentially drought, the kind of drought which we're already starting to look at now. Potential losses in biodiversity, species losses. We're looking at big threats to our coastal areas, so to stormwater, storm surge erosion along our coast. This is a picture from Milnerton, where we're starting to have quite serious issues in terms of damage to coastal infrastructure, private and public. Looking at potential increases in health impacts from increased temperatures, from decreased quality of water, from increases potentially in disease-borne vectors. Looking at a potential increase in wildfires, and that's due to increased temperatures drying out vegetation, but also once that vegetation catches a light, but due to higher wind speeds, looking at a much quicker spread of wildfires. Top left picture talks to the potential and already being felt increase in insurance premiums, and some of our properties along Cape Town's coast already been deemed to be uninsurable. So this is a picture of Harbour House, which is no longer insurable. Potential legislative issues for the city ourselves. We approve developments, and what we need to start being careful about is where we might be approving developments which are at risk. What is the liability that we sit with? Potential increase in social unrest. Food security is something that's being felt in a very real manner across the globe. And the impacts of climate change are set to increase that. Not just the availability of food, but with that, the price of food, the accessibility of food. Our harbour already has to close on certain days of the year due to high wind speeds when our cranes can't operate. So with increased wind speeds, we could be looking at an increased number of days where our harbour can't operate. And in terms of smaller fishing harbours, there's certain days where our smaller fishermen aren't able to take their boats out to sea. With various countries and South Africa itself responding to climate change, we could be facing increasing prices through things like carbon taxes. Electricity prices are something which are already on the increase, but with something like increased water security playing an increased role in the cost of electricity provision, we could see an even bigger increase in electricity prices. And last but by no means least is a huge threat to a huge increase in immigration. We're already seeing massive what we call climate refugee migration happening across the globe. And this is something which we need to look at quite seriously for Cape Town, particularly with our agricultural hinterland being under threat. In terms of the greenhouse gas picture, our total energy consumption growth between 2001 and 2012 was 26.8%. And our average annual energy consumption growth rate has been 2.18%. While that does still look high, we need to look at it against our average annual population growth rate of 2.6% and our average annual economic growth rate of 4%. So what these figures are showing us is, although our population and our economy are growing, our energy picture is not growing in tandem with those, which is a good news story. The problem is that good news story could be because of increased energy prices and could be because of load shedding, blackouts, etc. So days where we simply don't have energy. But what we need to see more of is this decoupling. So we still have economic growth, have population growth, and that's largely due to in-migration into the city, but with that we don't have a consequent energy growth. In terms of our current fuel sources, we very much follow the national picture. We get our energy, our electricity largely still from the national grid. So our liquid fuel is largely from fuel imports, and our electricity mirrors the national mix, with Eskom-based coal power providing 91%, Eskom nuclear-based providing 4%, and the Renewable Energy Independent Power Producers Program providing 5% across the country. This is something which City is actively working to try and move away from. We also look every couple of years at a breakdown of our energy picture. So which sectors in the city are using the most energy? And out of that use, where are we producing the most greenhouse gas emissions? And that gives us a sense as a city as where do we need to focus in terms of interventions. What's important to recognise, though, is that a lot of those interventions don't sit within the city mandate and within the city space. And that's something we need to look at quite carefully, is what are the levers we do have versus where we have an influencing role. But here, the key figures are for carbon emissions by sector. Transport is 33% of emissions, commercial sector 26%, residential sector 22%, and industrial sector 11%. What you'll see here is government is just 2% of this work, and yet a lot of the mitigation work that we do is within government buildings. Some people might question that, but the role that the cities they're playing is A, testing technology, B, also walking the talk, and C, looking at how it can play with different financial models and how those make sense to then enable change beyond government. So in terms of our climate change policy approach, we kind of have a few headline things, statements that we need to put forward. We do see climate change as a socio-economic issue with environmental consequences. Often it's put forward as an environmental issue, and we're saying there are massive issues in terms of socio-economic issues. The impacts of climate change are already being felt. This is something that's quite key to stress, because climate change is often seen as something that's fairly esoteric and in the future, and it's very much not that. Globally, we're seeing massive changes. Locally, we're seeing massive movements already in our fish species moving around the coast towards the east coast, which then has a knock-on effect in terms of fish processing plants having to move with those fish stocks. So they're very real changes that we are seeing right now. The natural environment and resource efficiency are key ways in which, if we manage those well, we can actually build resilience. And so what we need to look at is managing wetlands to be able to attenuate floods, to be able to clear water, etc., actually plays a key role. So while we need to manage the natural environment in and of for its own sake, we also need to see that as a key socioeconomic service to the city. So sometimes when the city talks about development and pro-poor versus climate change, we're very much trying to change that debate. It's not an either-or. It's that if we don't take some of these things into account, we actually could be leading to irresponsible development, and so we need to look at these part and parcel together. By 2030, the estimates are that 2/3 of the world population will be living in cities. So sometimes people bring forward the argument that the international climate change negotiations happens between nation states. And the question is often raised, what are cities and provinces doing in this game? Why are they interfering? But the reality is that with the majority of the world's population moving into cities, cities play an absolutely key role in terms of both mitigation and then adapting to those changes. Which takes us on to this issue of the lagged effect of greenhouse gas emissions, which I think has been touched on in the last few days, is that even if we control our emissions and reduce emissions now, we've fundamentally already changed the climatic system. So in terms of adaptation, in terms of being able to understand and respond to things like flood damage, droughts, etc., we need to be building that into our functioning and our service delivery right now. All this work is going to require us to work differently and collaboratively, both within our organisation and with external stakeholders. But we also recognise that there are potential opportunities. And this is sometimes where there's a key link between the green economy work and the climate change work that I'm involved in, is how do we actually use this as an opportunity to really develop clean tech, to really develop better ways and alternative technologies around sanitation, around water, etc., that actually serve a benefit of being able to handle climate changes that might come down the line, but also reduce our emissions so that we can play our role and contribute towards reducing those emissions. So essentially our policy approach is two kind of broad streams, but there are clear links between the two. The first, I'm hoping you can read those colours, the first is that of adaptation. So we talk about adaptation and mitigation in climate change. Adaptation is very much about preparing for the change at a local level to reduce risk and build adaptive capacity. Adaptive capacity, this term means how do we ensure that businesses, communities, infrastructure, etc., are able to withstand the changes that are going to happen. So there's a role that government plays, but there's also a role that businesses, communities, others are going to need to play to almost be resilient themselves, to be able to respond to change. And how do we build that and make sure that that's in place in the city? And then the mitigation side of things on the right-hand side is how do we contribute to the global efforts to reduce greenhouse gas emissions? So we very much need to play in both spaces. But playing in those spaces also leads to spin-offs. So on the adaptation side, big spin-offs there, potential improved quality of life, sustainable development, long-term fiscal efficiency, so enabling us to, or encouraging us as a city to use our budgets more efficiently. On the mitigation side, some of the spin-offs there are around improved energy security, reduced costs, and improved air quality. And then what we do in the policy is we've got to look quite carefully at what are the levers that we as a city either control directly or have a very strong influence over. So we need to look at our own operations. What do we do and how do we change our own operations? And through that, how do we potentially stimulate the market for certain technologies? How do we influence others? How do we do our planning as a city? What developments do we approve or not approve, with what conditions or not? What pricing role do we play? Whether it be rates, tariffs, what we charge for electricity, water, etc. How do we play with those pricing mechanisms? How do we look at fiscal reform? And by that we mean what money we spend where in the city on what type of service delivery. Is there a way of doing it better? Is there a way of spending more upfront to save down the line? Importantly, how do we look at issues of ecological infrastructure and ecosystem-based adaptation, which is essentially around how do we use natural systems to provide services that often in our wisdom we think we can provide through hard engineering? How do we look at what the best actually is in the face of climate change? What role does legislation play? What do we do in terms of bylaws and enforcing those bylaws? How do we stimulate the green economy, and how do we raise awareness, and not just raise awareness, but basically help behavior change to happen, both within our administration and external to our administration? And absolutely important is this bottom comment here: how do we build networks and do all this through networks, because the city is not a bubble. In terms of implementation to date, there's a lot of detail on the next 5-6 slides. This presentation will be put onto the summer school website. So any detail I don't go through here, that will be available there. But just to touch on some of the adaptation work that the city is doing. In the transport space, we've basically mapped infrastructure and networks at risk across the city. There's work underway that's been done to look at sustainable design and construction of roads. So with increased temperatures, certain road surface material might not be able to handle those increased temperatures. We're looking at exploring, different road surface material. We're also looking at issues around the South Peninsula Transport Corridor, so Glencairn, for example, where we have a railway line running right next to the coast, which is incredibly, very high risk area. So how do we look to protect that railway line? On the spatial planning front, the city's drafted a framework of resource-efficient criteria for development, which basically looks at issues of energy, water, materials used in housing and development. We've been working closely to look at how do we integrate climate change into the revision of the city's spatial development framework, an integrated development plan, water conservation and water demand management program. This is something which is very much at the fore at the moment in the press. The question sometimes is the city's putting a lot of messaging out for residents to use less. And the question sometimes is, well, what is the city doing? Actually a lot. So in this space, there's a lot of work happening around leak repair, around reducing pressure of water in the system, an active program of replacing water and sewer pipelines, water meters, etc. So the city's really trying to look at its infrastructure quite closely and see what it can do to reduce loss on that front. And then the other side of the coin, the water supply side, is the city's been involved in a lot of feasibility studies to look at alternative supplies, water supply options for Cape Town. The challenge with a lot of these supplies is the huge investment cost required for them. And this is where city needs to play a game in terms of its own figures, is at what point does it need to invest in massive new water supply infrastructure. And in the face of climate change, where we might be getting less rainfall, certain of those water supply options might not actually be recharged with water supplies as quickly as they need them to be. On the human settlements front, there are national building standards which basically call for the inclusion of adaptation-related measures, so the city implements those. On the biodiversity front, there's the BioNet, which basically plans out a biodiversity network for the city to also allow for resilience to climate change, so to allow for movement of species, but also to allow for ecological processes to continue along those corridors. There's a very active invasive species unit. So invasive species absorb a lot more water than natural vegetation. They also provide an incredible fire hazard, as well as taking over natural habitats for indigenous biodiversity. So there's a very active program through the expanded public works program, the national program, looking at clearing invasive species in Cape Town. But there's also a big focus on clearing invasive species through our waterways. So one big challenge we have is we have stormwater channels and rivers, etc., but with those channels being clogged up with invasive species, so water hyacinth, etc., they're not able to act as effective stormwater channels when we have big flood events. On the stormwater and disaster management front, modelling's been taking place to try update the flood lines around some of our major catchments in the city. So those flood lines are affected both by potential increases in rainfall and existing increases in rainfall or flood events, but also by development that's been approved. So certain areas which may have in the past absorbed certain rainfall events that have now been developed and hard surfaces put over, that actually changes the floodline pattern of the city. So update modelling is being done there. For some years now, the stormwater function in the city has been increasing the pipe diameter of all stormwater drains in new build in the city. Water-sensitive urban design principles. A question as to the extent to which these are being implemented, but essentially what that tries to do is say that instead of all stormwater being flushed out to sea as quickly in the quickest possible manner, how do we capture some of that water? How do we have more permeable developments to allow that water to recharge, for example, the groundwater aquifers? There's an increased focus on ecosystem-based adaptation as a means of floodwater protection. And there's a lot of work that's gone into flood risk reduction, so looking primarily at informal settlements across the city and trying to look at where are the most vulnerable settlements and putting interventions in place to reduce that vulnerability. On the coastal management front, there's a lot of work that's taken place really looking at integrated coastal management in the city. Important here is there's huge pressure to develop on the coast, but there's a huge risk to coastal development. So part of what the city's been doing is trying to understand where does that risk sit, what could or should coastal setback lines be, and if developments have already been approved, under what conditions should those be developed to A, minimise the risk to that development, and B, not transfer the risk to someone else along the coast. In terms of mitigation, so these are projects around reducing our greenhouse gas emissions. There's been a lot of work over the last few years focused on retrofitting our own city buildings, so with lighting, etc. Work also to retrofit the city's streetlights and city's traffic lights, so to low energy equivalents, which also leads to a huge cost saving for the city. That money can then be ploughed back into similar projects. Rooftop photovoltaic installations and feed-in tariffs, both within cities' buildings and within the private sector. There's been work for some time now on fleet greening of cities' own vehicles, and the city's recently signed a tender to make the new MyCity buses electric buses, which will then be powered by renewable energy. The city for some time now has been running a solar water heater supplier accreditation program, so that people who want to put a solar water heater onto their house have a sense as to who the fly-by-night suppliers are versus those that are trusted and tested. The city also runs a commercial energy efficiency forum, so this is working with the big retail centres in Cape Town and looking at them sharing with each other. It's almost a self-help group, as it were, as to what they're putting in place, different ways, different technologies, and different financial and costing mechanisms. And there's been a huge program funded by national government primarily on retrofitting low-cost houses with ceilings. Waste-to-energy projects is a growing area of focus for the city. This is very much not seen as a first-order response to waste, but very much at the end of the waste hierarchy. Spoken about that. And then transit-oriented design, so it should be transit-oriented design, is one of the ways in which the city is looking to expand and densify along certain transport-related corridors. And that's to make public transport more accessible, more affordable, more financially feasible. The city's also been looking at travel demand management plans. This is anything from trying to promote people within the city to work at satellite offices, work from home, flexi working, etc. Very much trying to test this model to then share that with other big corporates and other businesses. The city, and you often hear this in the press, is part of a lot of international networks that are climate change related. So we're part of C40 Cities Network, the Carbon Climate Registry, Durban Adaptation Charter, ICLEI, the Covenant of Mayors, and Mr. Urban Futures, among others. The questions we sometimes get asked are, what are the value add of these networks? I think the value add is huge from multiple perspectives. I think the one is really not having to reinvent the wheel over and over, but really learning from others. In these networks are not just big developed cities, whose challenges bear no resemblance to ours. There are a lot of developing country cities in these partnerships as well. What we also find is groups like the Mr. Urban Futures. Just one project that's currently underway is the development of a book, which we've got, I think it's 12 or 14 city officials partnered with 12 or 14 academics from UCT, and co-writing a book on various chapters on anything from water conservation to coastal management to biodiversity monitoring, etc. And looking at how are we looking at responding to climate change in the city space? What is the latest literature and research showing? What are others elsewhere in Africa or elsewhere doing? And how do we actually start marrying the two and really pushing the boundaries of how we're working in the city? So that's a classic example of a real partnership and a real knowledge co-production piece of work that's taking place. But one thing, we are part of a number of national networks, but I think sometimes we lose the focus a little bit on some of our national networks. And that's where we really need to focus. Is us, along with other cities in South Africa, face some of the same challenges around financial management frameworks, around our energy legislation and what we are and aren't allowed to do. And so we do work with other cities, but I think we need to work a lot more closely with other cities within South Africa and find those solutions collectively. So the question is, what keeps me awake at night? I guess my first response is my 9-month-old daughter who's teething. But on the work front, it's essentially around how do we fundamentally change how we work to catalyze action at scale and with urgency or a sense of urgency. So how do we make this transformative change happen? So it's just kind of mind the gap. We have great intentions of where we want to go. There's a lot of work that's been done. A lot of the work that's been done has, to all honesty, a lot of it's been good. A lot of it's been on kind of pilot basis, demonstration basis. We're still exploring, still testing. And what we've got to essentially look at is how do we marry this gap and really pull that together? So we have a couple of key approaches which we have challenges with, but which we need to unblock to be able to cover this gap. And I'll go into a little bit of detail on each of these four. And this is the last part of the presentation. The first is around people. The second is around technology or approaches. The third around finance and financing. And the fourth around networks. There are plenty of others, but these are just the ones that I'm going to touch on today. So the first is, as people, we all see the world with different lenses. So I'd like you to just take 30 seconds and take a look at the word diagram and see if you can, which words you can pick out. Can you see anything? Any others? Okay. A lot of words you got in a very short space of time. But essentially what this shows us is that everyone has a different way of focusing on things. So some of us will start at the top and work down. Some will start randomly in the middle. Some will just let their eye float and they'll just pick up what comes to them. Some will try to be clever and start looking diagonally. Some might start looking vertically. I think I got 2 vertically and I gave up. But it's essentially around, we view the world differently. So when I work with various line functions in the city, I work with engineers, I work with social scientists, I work with economists, I work with natural scientists. If I fail to engage with all those parties and to actually be willing to listen to what their pain points are, what they do, what they feel their role is, and how they're actually struggling in this debate, we're not going to get anywhere. So a key role in terms of what we need to do to make this policy happen in the city and respond effectively is how do we make time to actually understand each other's challenges and collectively find solutions. A key issue that people have, and I think this has been touched on in the last 2 days, is this issue of uncertainty. How do we manage things in the face of uncertainty? So for our water engineers, their question is, yes, the rainfall is a lot lower now, but how do we know that that rainfall is going to continue to be low in the next 4 or 5 years? How do I justify spending X billion on water extraction from the aquifer? What we're starting with the premise is not an uncertainty around if climate change is real or not. And that's quite an important assumption, statement to put up, is we're not looking at is there uncertainty about whether climate change is happening. Instead, as a city, we're trying to focus on the timing issue. When is the change going to happen? How big is that change going to be? And how often? Change in frequency of events, etc. And for this, we really need to increasingly use scenarios and narratives and other tools to constantly look at what the picture is showing us, what the evidence is showing us, but also to look at what the evidence might not be showing us directly, but we've got a sense of where things are going. We're looking at where things are going elsewhere. So in terms of managing in the face of uncertainty, it's very much a process. So it's understanding change management, understanding how people think, how people are comfortable to change or not. It's looking at building networks and relationships, and this is across the city. So whether that be with officials, with technocrats, but also with politicians. We've really got to understand what is it that's important to them, how do we talk a language that they understand, and how do we slowly get this messaging changed in the city. Incredibly important is this issue of accessing technical support. For a lot of people in the city, they are so incredibly stretched. I think our water department is currently sitting on a vacancy rate of something like 32%. They just cannot find the water engineers in this country. There's a massive skills issue. So you've got people who are working incredibly hard, working non-stop, and now we're asking them to do things differently. So to take that time out to actually do that work is incredibly hard. So what we need to do effectively in terms of coordinating adaptation in the city is how do we access that technical support, get support in for them? How do we help with cost-benefit analyses? So really looking at a long-term approach. If you take option A, what is that going to cost in the short term, CapEx, versus your long-term operating costs versus option B? And importantly, we've got to learn from elsewhere. We can't keep operating in a bubble and pretending that we can find the solution on our own. We've got to learn from others. And we've also got to say that working with other cities in South Africa or elsewhere, how do we actually share out this load of figuring out solutions? And lastly, we've really got to push this message that resilience, climate change, kind of pro-climate change type development is good development. It's responsible development and it's long-term development. On technology and approaches, just one slide is we have some big challenges around untested versus tested technology or approaches. And some of this is governed by our financial management frameworks. And a key challenge here is to what extent does something need to be tested before we can actually implement it into city functions? And here again, I think, is the power of networks. Sometimes the assumption is we need to test it within our own realm of our own city before it's regarded as tested. And there we need to work a lot more closely with our national government department, with our national treasury, who are open to working with us, and really looking at it as a collective, how do we test technologies and approaches and almost pass them by the rules of the financial management frameworks. There's also a big fear of white elephants. So a number of years ago, huge drought crises in the Southern Cape, so desalination plants set up, which were then too expensive to run. So there is that fear. So transport engineers, water engineers, etc., look at those kind of projects and back right off and use that potentially as an excuse to not take action. And so this is something we've got to create, is a space for innovation, the space to allow engineers to fiddle with different options and to make mistakes, but also then be able to correct those mistakes or inaccuracies in terms of what's happened. Life cycle costing is another key thing we've got to look at. We often don't go for certain technologies because we say it's going to be more expensive. But what we're not looking at is the down the line picture. We also need to move away from this assumption that we need to centralize and bulk all service delivery and look at much more of a decentralized approach to service delivery and an alternative technology approach. And then we often have this debate internally about, do we retrofit? So before technology or infrastructure is obsolete or equipment, do we replace it? Or do we wait until technology is or infrastructure is obsolete and then replace it when it needs to be replaced? And what are the cost implications around that? So it moves us onto this issue of finance. It's very easy to talk about what we think we need to do. It's very easy to say we should invest now rather than waiting 5 years. The reality is city budgets. Our city budgets are limited. So if you just take this as an example and you say very roughly our city budget is spent between human settlements provision, water and waste provision, solid waste, for example, and electricity. We divide our budget up a certain way, and each year we relook at where we need to focus our spend on and how we best divide up that budget. So if we need additional money to do things differently or to spend more upfront to save down the line, where do we get the extra budget from? We can't magically expand our budget. There'd be political outcry if we just pushed up everyone's rates and revenues. Huge issues in terms of this assumption that in terms of international climate change response, that there'd be pots of money and funds and grants to help us do this work. The reality is, although that money is starting to be collected and starting to be realized, very little of it currently is floating down to a local context. So we have a big challenge with where do we find the money. So our other alternative is to look at, do we reprioritize within our city budgets? Do we say, right, human settlements is our biggest focus? And what we need to do is take money away from electricity provision and put it into human settlements. Do we say, actually, our biggest focus is on water provision? Water is our biggest crisis. Let's take it away from human settlements and put it into water, because without water, we don't have a city. And this is a constant debate the city is having to go through. What we also need to look at is, by climate proofing, for example, our human settlements that we build, do we build 5 houses, which we openly know aren't climate proof, and we leave it up to communities, NGOs, etc., to better climate proof those houses? Or do we only provide 2 in potentially better located land with more energy efficient materials, etc.? It doesn't necessarily need to be an either or, but often, particularly in a transition phase, this debate starts coming down to an either or. So some of the upfront questions we need to ask around the finance space are, how much of a buffer do we have to absorb shocks? So that's both in terms of resources, but also in terms of finances. If we had some massive disaster events in the city, bigger than anything we've experienced now, do we actually have the finances to be able to respond to those events? To what extent do we spend now to save later? And to what extent does it make more sense for us to get, for example, external loans, etc., to really be bold and do a massive push as a city now in order to save down the line, either for the city itself or for our residents? To what extent do we move to a preventative versus a reactive approach? So our disaster management function in the city is very much trying to look at taking a more preventative stance to minimizing risks and minimizing impacts to communities rather than shipping everyone off to halls once a disaster event has happened. A big question around who has what mandate and what responsibility. So a classic issue here is around energy and electricity in this country. There's a lot of work that the city would like to do that sits in the national mandate. There's a lot of work that people think sits in the national mandate, but actually as a city we do have a key role to play. And what we need to do is play around in this space and say, where can we actually move in and take action? And how do we also work with national? So it's not seen as this either-or game, but actually how do we come to the party and say, well, you've got a pain point here and this is how we can relieve that pain point. And then how do we prioritize in a city? Which is more important? Is it our higher economic groups because they bring in our rates and rebates in the city? Is it our lower economic groups because we have an equity issue, a social responsibility issue? We need to care for communities. Is our focus on water? Is our focus on electricity? Is our focus on social development, education, etc.? It's this constant weighing up of prioritizing. And importantly, what trade-offs do we make? And this is something which, as a city, we need to look at very closely. When we approve developments in a certain area, are we really considering all the trade-offs? Are we considering that by approving that development, we might be setting ourselves up for a bit of trouble 5, 10, 15 years down the line? So in terms of the finance side, what we need to look at in terms of trying to answer some of these questions and being able to kind of expand the pie is, first what I spoke about was using existing budgets. But here we've got to look quite carefully at how do we work with national as well. We do sometimes try to solve the picture looking just at the city boundaries. And through that also look at how do we work more efficiently, how do we shuffle budget between priorities. And that change primarily needs to be informed by what we call evidence-based decision making, so cost-benefit analysis and policy alignment. So are we making certain decisions and investing in certain technologies, for example, on the one hand, but another department has got a policy that's completely contrary to that? And then external funding we do need to look at. So revenue, and we do look at issues around revenue, around water, waste, electricity revenue, rates, etc. To what extent can we look further at the grant space? Loans, either straight loans from banks or also the development finance institutes, groups like French Development Bank, who are really trying to look at providing very low interest loans because they really want to advance this agenda of climate change within service delivery of cities. And then mechanisms such as green bonds, which we are openly exploring within the city at the moment, and really looking at how do we certify projects against international climate development standards, how do we look at the way in which we monitor what those projects are set out to achieve, taking those to market, seeing what kind of bond finance loan we can get, coupon rate we would get, And then from that, looking at what the city could do in terms of looking at green bonds as a form of finance. And my second last slide is just on networks, is the city is codependent on so many other parties. We need to work more closely with civil society, academia, business, industry, educators, NGOs, and other spheres of government. But when we say working together, what we do need to do is work to understand what are the risks that climate change potentially poses to each of these groups, including ourselves. What is the adaptive capacity of all of these groups? What is their ability to be able to respond to change? And where that ability is low, how do we work collectively to increase that adaptive capacity? What are the strengths and mandates of each? So sometimes government can fall into the trap of trying to solve everything on its own. And there's certain things, for example, within the the private sector, where we simply don't have the expertise or the mandate to actually drive. But how do we work with business and the business sector to say, that's where we see your role and responsibility. What can we play to unlock any legislative barriers, for example, so that you can play your role more effectively? And that comes to the last point of trying to work together to identify who plays what role. So my last slide is just a summary slide, saying the big focus of what we need to look at to enable me to sleep at night is how do we bring everyone along? How do we enable innovation in a city space? How do we develop and use alternative forms of financing? And that all of this is only possible in collaboration with others. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Helen. We've got 15 minutes of questions. Well, there's at least one floating around somewhere in the audience. So, Helen, it's up to you to field the questions.
Right, sir.
You put up a number of mitigating measures. I would submit that every one of those mitigating measures are things that we should be doing anyway, irrespective of whether there's any climate change at all. You look at the water situation, you look at the energy situation, you look at waste, you look at transport. Those are all things that we are not operating sustainably, and we should be doing that, irrespective of whether the climate changes. So that's just a passing comment, but now comes my real key question. About 11,000 years ago, the Ice Age ended, and since then, the sea level has risen by around 130 meters. But there's been, up until the last 70, 80 years, there's been no serious carbon influence at all. Now we sit with climate models that are claiming that it is entirely carbon that is causing the problem. I want to ask you first, what percentage of all the stuff that you showed us can be ascribed to anthropogenic changes as opposed to that natural change in climate which has occurred over 11,000 years and which will go on? And there's nothing to say that we're not going to get a temperature dip in the next few years. So that's the level of uncertainty that was talked about in yesterday's lecture needs to come right up to the front before we start talking about all these magic models. Because as Richard Feynman said, models don't work.
Okay, thank you for the question. I think what I need to respond to two things. I think the one is a lot of this action we should be doing anyway. That's agreed. I think what climate change has done, the agenda of climate change, is it's pushed the urgency for a lot of this work. And that's where we use it as an agenda to say these are key things which we should be managing and should be doing as a city. But climate change gives us that extra emphasis, and it also enables us to look at the buffers that we have. Is that we have buffers for certain systems, but with climate change those buffers disappear, and they disappear quite rapidly. I'm not going to go into detail on your second question, apart from to say that the IPCC, the International Panel of Climate Change, does its annual reviews. Those reviews are incredibly scientifically thorough. I'm happy to put the email address or the web address onto the summer school webpage for people to access those reports. My premise in terms of uncertainty for the city is we're not debating whether climate change is real or not. We feel there's enough scientific evidence there. Our question is we're already starting to see enough change now, and we're seeing enough threat of increased change coming that we can't wait for further evidence to be able to take action. We need to take action now, otherwise we're actually not being responsible. Okay, but happy to send those links to you. Sorry, at the back.
So, in fact, sort of to follow up on that question, the issue is how much of an emphasis do you put on mitigation versus adaptation? And that's what I'm sort of asking the city. How much do you focus on the adaptation versus mitigation?
Yeah, so we're focusing on both at the moment. For a long time, the city focused primarily on mitigation in terms of being quite straight for climate change response, and that follows the international negotiations. It follows what a lot of other countries and cities have been doing for some time. A lot of the adaptation work has actually been happening quietly in the background, but hadn't necessarily been labelled as climate change for many years. And that's coming to the fore now in terms of really coordinating our adaptation response. We do have a role to play in both. Mitigation, we have an absolutely key role to play with a city of 3.8 million people, and with by 2030, 66% of the world's population being in cities, we absolutely need to play a mitigation role. But we can't avoid adaptation. Sea level rise, increased flooding, drought, etc., all those kind of impacts are going to affect our citizens and our economy here. So we absolutely have to play a role in both. So we do see both as important. Yeah.
And one thing I find very strange for a very responsible two things. One is, given that you know these things, that we still have just approved 2 new coal-fired power stations, and nuclear is also a very, very strong carbon-producing industry as well. And the second thing is that we store all our nuclear fuel on Koeberg, on site, even though the Larsen C shelf is going to go, they say sometime in the next month. And they don't know what's going to happen with the result of some kind of tsunami that might come from any glacier that might get dislodged as a result of it. So why are we so responsible on one hand and so totally irresponsible on the other?
Okay, so to respond to that, the coal-fired power stations and the nuclear debate in this country doesn't sit with city mandate. We certainly don't approve a coal-fired power station. That's national government. The nuclear decisions are taken at a national level. There's a big question around nuclear at the moment in terms of we have national plans around energy, electricity for the country. Nuclear is sometimes in there, sometimes it's not. It's a debate which we as a city feel we need to engage a lot more in, but actually it's completely beyond our responsibility. What we're trying to do is say, at the moment, we draw most of our power from the national electricity network, the distribution network. What can we do to basically reduce our reliance on that network? So to what extent can we promote renewable energy? To what extent can we promote energy efficiency so we're using less? And very much trying to focus on where do we have control, or where are we able to wrest some of that control? But I'm afraid coal-fired power and nuclear doesn't sit with a local government mandate. Yeah. Or storing nuclear on site, again, that's Eskom. That's nuclear, that's Eskom. What the city does have is the city works with disaster management department, works closely with Eskom in terms of evacuation plans, announcements, being able to get people out in time, etc., etc. The city would like to expand more and more around the Koeberg area, and that actually starts, the Koeberg plant actually hampers some of our potential expansion.
In terms of mitigation, there's been quite a bit of practical stuff done. People have been encouraged to put in solar. Some cities make it mandatory for new developments to install rainwater harvesting tanks when they do new developments. What about making it mandatory for new developments or new housing projects to include waterless toilets or composting toilets? If we stopped peeing in our drinking water, we'd have a lot more. There is the technology, there are these examples of quite acceptable composting and waterless toilets. Where's the city on that?
Yeah, I think you raised some very good points. I think in terms of things like solar water heaters, we've been helped by national building regulations which say that I think it's 40 or 50% of all water heating needs to come from a solar pump or a solar water heater, which we then implement. I think technology such as rainwater harvesting, waterless sanitation, etc., we absolutely have to look at a lot more seriously, and we need to look at how do we build that into legislation. Important with that is what role do we play in terms of enabling, what role do we play in terms of enforcement. But what a lot of these things do, we talk about that there's a lack of cultural acceptance for certain things. What we need to look at is to what extent do we need to be bold and say this will be the norm. And to what extent by being bold does that actually stimulate an industry, stimulate the green economy, so that a lot of these products and services can be provided much cheaper than they currently are now. So I think there's a massive role there that the city does need to play. And that's effectively where we need to look at, we approve developments with conditions, what kind of technologies could we bring in there? There's often this fear that the more stringent we make our building development conditions, the more developers will be prone to go to other cities. Personally, I think with a city as beautiful as Cape Town, as much opportunity and economic opportunity here, I don't think we should be fearing that. I think we should say this is where we want to go as a city. This is what we require to go as a city. We don't think this is unreasonable in the face of some of the sustainability, climate change, etc., other challenges that we face. But I think we could play a strong role there. Yeah.
This side, please.
Oh, sorry. Sorry, I'll come here.
Is there a name who is taking the responsibility for that project? Who's the doer?
Okay. The question was, who's the doer? Who's taking responsibility for all of this work? Yeah, so the policy and the development of the policy I'm responsible for at the moment. What we're currently trying to look at in the city is institutionally, where do we better position climate change, the climate change function. That's being decided at the moment. There's a whole organisation redesign process at the moment. Part of the talk is whether it should stay in environmental management. Another big school of thought is that it should go under what's going to be a new resilience function in the Mayor's office, which would give it much more profile, would force the city to bring these issues into any kind of development approvals, planning approvals, etc., that the city issues, and would also hopefully give better resources to this work. Yeah, I hope that answers the question. Sorry, your gentleman to your left. Okay. All right. Okay. Yes.
First of all, what's the city going to be doing about landfill gas? When Johannesburg and Durban have already got landfill gas going, and we're throwing our methane into the atmosphere. Of course, it is a fairly active greenhouse gas. We would run our entire taxi fleet off the You spoke about the white elephants. We've got solar water heaters in the worst possible place where all the tourists coming through Cape Town International Airport, which are facing the south, which is obviously the wrong way from the place. When you address those, thank you.
Great.
Repeat the question.
Sorry, so the two questions were around what is the city doing around landfill gas, and a question also around the positioning of solar water heaters, that some of our developments, solar water heaters clearly aren't north-facing. I think on the landfill gas question, the city has run pilots for a while, and at the moment the city's gone through an extensive process and has just recently appointed about 8 months ago, what's called a transaction advisor. And part of that role is essentially to look at our whole waste space. So to try and look at where should the city be focusing and in what proportion in terms of recycling, waste minimization, landfill gas, etc. The city's also been driving, and it was approved about a year and a half ago, is what's called a programmatic approach to the clean development mechanism for landfill gas projects. And what that does is it enables landfill gas projects, not just here, but anywhere in the country, to be able to apply for carbon credits as an offset for landfill gas costs. The solar water heater positioning, there's been a massive issue across the country in terms of quality of solar water heaters, and in terms, part of that quality is how they're positioned. I mean, KwaZulu-Natal has even had examples where they've been installed on the ground. So it's a big quality issue, and that's why the city's solar water heater accreditation program does regular quality control checks on the actual systems themselves, but also how they're installed, because it's recognized that it's given the industry a very bad name. Yeah. Yes.
Just about the landfill question, one of the things I've noticed in Kingston is people are really bad at recycling. Is there anything that the city can do to promote more recycling in households so that the landfills don't get filled up with?
Yeah, so it's an ongoing issue at the moment. So that's linked to that transaction advisor I spoke about. So part of what they're looking at is to what extent should we be focusing on the recycling picture? And then within the recycling picture, to what extent should the city be trying to control things? So trying to control collections through to a central drop-off point, package waste, give it out to a tenderer or contractor to then sell on to the recycling market, versus to what extent do we support small contractors, small developers who actually already collected multiple houses? How do we actually create an enabling environment for them? Or is it a hybrid of the two? So yes, agree, recycling has a long way to go in the city. Part of what we also need to look at is this whole value chain. It's one thing for waste to be collected and to be compacted, but then does it have someone to then pass it on to? Are products being made, and is there a market for those products? So part of what we need to look at is what is that feedback loop into the recycling products. Yeah. So,
do you think the city has done enough to educate people on issues of part of this whole scenario that are really important? I take, for instance, our current water crisis. Have we really brought home to the citizens of Cape Town just how poorly they manage their own water? Because it seems to be, looking around, that the bulk of people don't even know there's a crisis.
Yeah.
Don't really even speak to them. They're completely unaware that they're under regulation.
Yeah. Personally, I think there's a huge space, and this is where we really need to engage more with education experts, NGOs, business organizations, etc., to say, how do we get that message across? What is the most effective way? What are the most effective channels? I mean, at the moment, it feels like the water crisis is a water crisis. There's a lot of messaging about it, but as you say, you still see people with hoses watering down bins, watering down driveways, etc. The city the other day published, I can't remember the figure of how much they've issued in fines in terms of people using water poorly against level 3 water restrictions, but yet we still aren't seeing a drop-off in water use. So I think there's a big role we can play, and this is where we can potentially engage with UCT and their behaviour economics unit. What makes people change? Is it that we actually need to switch water off for a full day at a time and say, right, to see how it feels, this is a test, see how it feels, switch it back on, say we're going to check how levels are within the next week, 2 weeks, switch it off again. Do we need shock tactics? Do we need approaches like Mark was saying the other day in Sydney, where it took 10 years of awareness campaigns till it's now second nature when people wash their hands. They switch the tap on, wet their hand, switch the tap off, soap their hands, and then put the tap back on. It took 10 years of awareness campaigns. But I think we do need to understand what makes people change. Because without that, I think we're going to be fighting a losing battle. Yeah. No, thanks. Sorry, sir.
A point about the fires that have occurred over the last couple of years.
Yeah.
You know, a Fynbos fire is bad enough, but a fire in mature stands of Roykrans and Port Jackson and Gum is 100 times worse. Now, I see driving around the peninsula that there seems to be no effort being made to clear exotics from areas close to human habitation. And I just wonder, there used to be a program for clearing the exotics. It seems to have dried up and stopped altogether. But from the point of view of fire prevention, this surely is something which should be either mandatory or promoted.
Yeah, so I think, you're spot on with the fact that alien vegetation creates a much hotter fire. Through that hotter fire, it also completely destroys the soil once a fire has happened. There is a very, very active alien invasive species program operationally now within the city. One of the big challenges we have as private land versus public land is the city may not clear on private land. And this is something which we're trying to engage with National Department on, is how do we issue notices, or how does national government issue notices to private landowners to clear their vegetation? What's happened in some of the fires in the past, some of the big fires, is that landowners who haven't actually cleared their alien vegetation have effectively resulted in properties further away from the mountain being burnt. So there's a big issue of liability there as well. But absolutely agree, it's something we need to look at very carefully. The city has got a very active program. They work closely with the Table Mountain National Park and essentially map out, and that mapping is done on a continual basis to look at where the high-risk areas are, what should be cleared, etc. Patrick?
Yeah, you mentioned earlier, and your backup by another gentleman here, you mentioned the right thing to do. So there are a lot of right things to do, and solar hot water heaters facing the right way is one of them. but there are many others, and most of them will lead to money saving, which otherwise would have been revenue to the city. So at a philosophical and economic level, how does the city deal with that tension of possibly having to downscale itself from a workforce of around about 25,000 people to much?
It's one of a series of climate change related films. This one is particularly around understanding how we might actually work to get the earth a bit cooler, I guess. Yeah. So 9:30 a.m. on Friday, if you're looking for something to do.
Great. Thanks very much for the introduction, Mark. Thank you very much for your time today. What I'd like to run us through is just a sense of framing the policy. How do we see climate change in the city? How do we think we should be approaching climate change? And also looking at our context. What is our current context in terms of greenhouse gas emissions and in terms of climate change adaptation? What are the key risks that we face as a city? Then look importantly at what we've done to date. We certainly aren't starting from a clean slate. The city's been working on a lot of climate change related action for some time. So I'll run you through some of that work. And then look at really what keeps me awake at night. What's the gap between where we're trying to go and what we've implemented to date? And then just close off with how we close that gap. So in terms of framing the policy, very simply, you've had the scientific and technical discussions in the last 2 days in terms of climate change globally, locally, and some of the key changes we're expecting to see in Cape Town. But in a very brief nutshell, we're looking at potentially a decrease in average annual rainfall for Cape Town, but also a change in seasonality of that rainfall. When we do get our rainfall, we're looking at having that in increased storm events, so increased frequency and magnitude of storm events. We're looking at increased temperatures, so that's not just average temperatures, but also increased number of days with heat waves, extreme temperature days. If you thought Cape Town was windy enough, we're looking at increased average wind speeds, an increased number of days with extreme winds, and all of this on top of a mean sea level rise. So what does that mean for Cape Town? Just a few photographs to take you through some of the key impacts we're likely to see from climate change and that we are partly already experiencing at the moment. Potentially flooding and damage of infrastructure from increased rainfall, but on the other side, potentially drought, the kind of drought which we're already starting to look at now. Potential losses in biodiversity, species losses. We're looking at big threats to our coastal areas, so to stormwater, storm surge erosion along our coast. This is a picture from Milnerton, where we're starting to have quite serious issues in terms of damage to coastal infrastructure, private and public. Looking at potential increases in health impacts. From increased temperatures, from decreased quality of water, from increases potentially in disease-borne vectors. Looking at it.
Science CTAP lectures, myself and Chris Jack, on Monday and Tuesday. Now we're getting a little bit more into the practice and policy space, and we're very lucky to have Helen Davies here, who's going to be talking to us about the City of Cape Town's sort of climate change response. I guess what they've done and what they're planning to do and what their policies are going to be like. So Helen is Head of Environmental Policy and Planning in the City of Cape Town. She's got specific responsibilities for the city's climate change policy, so kind of what are we going to do and strategy side of it. And then particularly for coordinating all the adaptation actions that are happening in the city. So both in terms of planning and but also implementing adaptation actions. So that's sort of at the coalface type work. And then she's also responsible for coordinating and leading the work that the city does on green economy, which is a bigger sort of domain that encompasses essentially what an environmentally sustainable economy might look like. Helen is another of these people who never seem to have left UCT. She's got a BSc in Environmental Science and Oceanography, then did honours in Atmospheric Science, rather like Chris Jack, and then a Master's in Conservation Biology, also at UCT, and then finished off with an MBA at UCT. And then, so she's got more degrees than most of us put together, I think. She's been working for the last 20 odd years or so in both public and private practice, if you like. Initially in the city of Cape Town, it was a junior position. Then she went to the UK for a while and worked in the sustainability division of a county council there. Came back and did quite a bit of consulting work on sustainability issues. And then, I guess, about 5 years ago, or so 6 years ago, moved to the provincial government to work in the climate change division there. And then a couple of years ago, moved back to the city into her current position. So she's got many years' experience in the public sector, and I'd like you to welcome her. Look forward to listening to her talk. I also have to do some advertising on behalf of the summer school team. So on Friday, this Friday at 9:30 in the morning in the new economics building, which is just the next door building on the Cape Town side of this one, there's a film starting at 9:30 called Cool Earth.
Potential increase in wildfires, and that's due to increased temperatures drying out vegetation, but also once that vegetation catches a light, but due to higher wind speeds, looking at a much quicker spread of wildfires. Top left picture talks to the potential and already being felt increase in insurance premiums, and some of our properties along Cape Town's coast already been deemed to be uninsurable. So this is a picture of Harbour House, which is no longer insurable. Potential legislative issues for the city ourselves. We approve developments, and what we need to start being careful about is where we might be approving developments which are at risk. What is the liability that we sit with? Potential increase in social unrest. Food security is something that's being felt in a very real manner across the globe. And the impacts of climate change are set to increase that. Not just the availability of food, but with that, the price of food, the accessibility of food. Our harbour already has to close on certain days of the year due to high wind speeds when our cranes can't operate. So with increased wind speeds, we could be looking at an increased number of days where our harbour can't operate. And in terms of smaller fishing harbours, there's certain days where our smaller fishermen aren't able to take their boats out to sea. With various countries, and South Africa